part of the Schumann Cello Concerto with Misha Maisky and the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. We had to fade that out because the work is continuous. We'll talk about that a little later. That is the work that Colin Carr will be performing tonight with the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra. And this is Colin Carr's fourth time in Winnipeg since 2011. He first performed in the inaugural International Cello Festival, and he left the audience breathless. He returned to play with the MCO and then another cello festival in 2014. Colin Carr is praised for his soulful playing, his warm and singing tone, and his ability to communicate deeply with audiences. He's performed the world over with the likes of the Royal Philharmonic, the BBC Symphony, the Royal Concertgebouw, the Chicago, Los Angeles, Montreal, Toronto Symphony Orchestras, not to mention chamber music and solo recitals. And it is my pleasure to welcome Colin Carr into our Classic 107 studios.
Thank you.
And why do you like to come back to Winnipeg so much?
I don't know. It's just one of those things that's happened. We were talking about it last night, and it's like a home away from home already. I come almost every year. Long may it last. I enjoy it so much. I love your climate.
Right, especially a rainy day like today.
But
yes.
actually, it's just a wonderful music-loving audience here that seems so engaged. And that's, of course, the thing that matters most to me.
Right. How many miles did you run this morning, by the way?
6.
6 miles?
Along the river walk, yeah. I hardly miss a day.
Now, how do you manage that in a foreign city? I mean, without getting lost?
Well, the two things that I look for the moment I arrive anywhere are, first and foremost, a place to run, outside if possible, because a lot of hotels now have gyms and treadmills, but I prefer not to be a rodent on a treadmill. So a place to run and some Wi-Fi access. And if I have those two things and my cello, then I'm all set.
All right. So what do you think about as you're running? Are you listening to great music? Are you thinking about your performance?
I never listen to music when I'm running because it seems so strange to me that my feet will be going pit-pat at the wrong speed for the music.
Right.
So I just can't do that.
Otherwise, you'd have to plan very carefully the music according to tempo.
That's right. So, no, actually, I think I empty my mind when I run. I think about things if I absolutely have to. But in a way, it's more a kind of meditation for me. It's a question of unloading rather than loading.
Okay. And do you measure your runs in miles or kilometers?
Well, miles, although I'm more or less conversant in both these days.
How important is it for a cellist to be physically fit?
Well, you have to ask lots of different cellists that question. I mean, for this cellist, it's very important. But I think for a lot of cellists, not just cellists, but musicians, they will really only exercise if they to get from the hotel to the rehearsal, you know. For me, it's really one of the two things that I do at the beginning of the day before anything else is running and practicing the cello. And if I can accomplish those two things before anything else, then I feel that the whole of the rest of the day I can enjoy.
Okay. Well, you currently divide your time between the Royal Academy of Music in the UK and Stony Brook University in New York. That must be a very grueling schedule.
I do fly between London and New York twice a month, 2 round trips a month. So there's a lot of wear and tear there. But I love the teaching. The teaching for me is an absolutely indispensable part of my musical activities. And I try to organize it so that if there are concerts in the US or Canada, I tie those in with a trip to Stony Brook, which is what I'm doing now, tomorrow.
Okay.
I fly back to New York and do some teaching for 2 or 3 days.
I noticed that you started teaching when you were just 25 at the very prestigious New England Conservatory. What was that like to be teaching at such a young age?
Well, it was a challenge, and I had some students who were actually older than I was at the time. So that was a little bit of a strange feeling. I tried not to intrude too much on what they were doing. At that time, I must say, I was not imagining myself as a teacher, and I didn't think that teaching would become so important to me. At that moment, it was more a question of necessity because in 1983, when I was 25 years old, I had the possibility to buy this cello, which I'm playing tonight. And it's a wonderful cello and extremely expensive. And I needed to have reliable income. The thing about concerts is, yes, I had a lot of concerts, but you just never know what's going to happen next year, or you might injure yourself and be out of commission for years. And so having a regular teaching job really seemed like a sensible thing to do, and that allowed me to negotiate a deal for this cello, in fact, to over 5 years, which was the only way I could possibly buy a cello of this quality. And my goodness, that's proved to be one of the wisest things that I ever did in my life.
Well, in the end, now teaching is an important part of your career. How important is it to you personally to pass on?
Very, very much. And it's not just a question of passing on my wisdom. I actually feel very privileged to work with the most talented students who already play on an extremely high level, and that I feel I learn just as much from them as I'm able to teach them. I mean, they're not consciously teaching me, but to hear this music, which I play so often, and to hear it played on a day-to-day basis by so many different people, and there are often people who are playing these pieces for the first time in their lives, so they're coming to this music completely fresh, and sometimes it just uncovers a new view of this music that I'm so familiar with.
You know, I wanted to ask you about interpretation because just yesterday on the show, we were featuring a number of different cellists, and I was just so struck by how different the styles of each cellist were. So we had Rostropovich, who was playing Bach, and it was sturdy and measured, and then Anna Bilsma was just playing with wild abandon. So what about you? What is your approach to making sound, making music?
Well, I don't know if I have a specific approach that I can pigeonhole. If we're talking about Bach, my approach is certainly more akin to Anna Bilsma's than Rostropovich's, because Bilsma really was a hero of mine for a long time, and he opened my eyes to a completely different way of playing Bach that was much freer and more imaginative and visionary. So in Bach, yes, I think we have a lot to learn from the Baroque players. In music in general, I have something of a mantra as far as cello playing and cello sound goes that I keep repeating to myself and to my students. And that's a very simple mantra, which is clarity and depth. So clarity of sound and articulation, but also really depth of sound, something which wells up from our center, from my center, and which then I hope communicates itself to a listener to their center. And I find that helps me very much to engage more directly with an audience. Actually,
this links very nicely to what you've just said, because every time I see you perform, I just get this sense of joy and of also being so engrossed in the music. And so after all these years, can you talk about the pleasure of performing
certainly.
This music?
Thinking a little more about this question of engagement with the listener. Another thing that I really like to think of as an image when I'm playing is, rather than me playing the music, there's a sense of the music playing me. That's, for me, a very important vision, an important image, because if it's the performer playing the music, there's a sense of controlling it and pushing buttons and pulling strings and this kind of thing, which the audience senses and can get in the way a little bit. It's a much better feeling if the performer is somehow riding the wave which is provided by this great music.
Okay.
And that helps me to feel at one with both music and instrument. And I think if that can be achieved, then we're really getting somewhere. If the music and the instrument and the player and the space in which we're performing are all in sync, then we're doing well.
Right. Well, every time I've heard you perform, it's just all come together, and you can just tell that the music is coming first for you, and the great pleasure that you take in performing it.
Well, thank you.
Tonight we're going to hear you perform the Schumann Cello Concerto. We've heard a little bit of it before we started our chat, and I wonder if you can tell us about it, set it up for us.
Well, it's one of my great favorites as far as cello concertos are concerned. Schumann is actually one of my favorite composers. His music is quintessentially romantic.
Yes.
And full of great beauty, love, and poetry. But he was also, of course, a tortured soul. And there's a great deal of anguish in Schumann's music, which certainly comes across in this piece. But it's anguish mixed in with a lot of very positive and life-affirming feelings as well. And that is what makes his music bittersweet, but that's life, and it seems so essential to us and the human condition.
And so, does that present challenges for you then to blend this anguish and then to contrast it with more songful passages?
Well, it's a challenge in a sense, but I think that's the way we are. So actually, it feels very honest, because I think we all share Schumann's anguish. I mean, he was actually schizophrenic, and so I hope we don't all share that condition. But in his music, there are great and sudden contrasts and juxtapositions of these kinds of conflicting feelings and emotions. And I think the ability as a performer to get under his skin and feel those contrasts and conflicts really are essential if the performance is going to be a success.
And the piece moves without a break. All three movements are connected as well. That
was a structure which he was very fond of. He used it several times. It's not just that the three movements are played without a break, but they are inextricably linked in their content as well. There are just a very few motives in this piece which he turns around and upside down, and they're almost unrecognizable unless you really go looking for them. And then you see how brilliantly and superbly the piece has been crafted. And from that point of view, it reminds me of great literature or drama like Shakespeare. You can enjoy a Shakespeare play on a certain level just for the plot, but once you start digging and you see how it's been constructed and how all the motives just keep recurring, and some of them are very clear and direct, and sometimes they're well hidden, but this is just the same thing. And the more curious you are as a performer, but also as a listener too, then I think the more able we are to enjoy the piece on many different levels.
All right. Well, we are all so looking forward to the performance tonight with the Manitoba Chamber Orchestra. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And we're going to go out listening to more Colin Carr, this time playing Mendelssohn's Sonata No. 2 in D, the second movement. Colin Carr with Thomas Sauer. Thanks once again, and we'll look forward tonight.
Thank you.